This is Emanuel Pastreich, independent candidate for president, and I'm taking on the most important topic really at this moment when we face both internal chaos and privatization of basically everything and the threat of world war. And that is, what exactly is the relationship between the United States and Israel? You've heard the expression, the tail wagging the dog, and some people say Israel's the tail wagging the United States. But sometimes we get a little confused about who's wagging whom. So I have with me today Tony Hall and John Spritzler, who are extremely distinguished experts on Israel, and we'll have an honest discussion about what's really going on in Israel, how Israel is related to the United States in this very complex relationship, and what the implications are for the world at this moment, especially in these last 3 weeks before the American election, which could be the opening of the gates of hell. So I'll start with Tony, Professor Hall. Where do you see the relationship and where it is now, how it got here, and where we're heading?
Well, that's a big question. Okay, so there is this philosophy, this ideology, this historical phenomena called Zionism. And Zionism, of course, is came out of the idea that the Jewish people should have a nation, a nationality of their own, a place-based nationality. Well, what about the Torah? What about the Old Testament? Isn't there some passages in there that talk about Israel having been given this territory by Yahweh? And so a lot of Christian Zionists took that very seriously. Like before there was Jewish Zionism, there was Christian Zionism. John Nelson Darby, this Anglo-Irish thinker, a very highly placed individual, sort of started this discussion. Apparently there was a lot of people in the Dublin area, Anglo-Irish, that went along with it. Lo and behold, Herzl takes it up, and there's this whole idea of among Jews that yeah, this is a good idea, and we need to distinguish ourselves and get a place of our own in this era of imperialism and nationalism. We're kind of being left out if we don't have our own country, and they found a lot of empathy for this among Christian leaders and aristocrats, especially in Britain. And so this Zionist movement, is very fascinating. And so nowadays, this Zionist movement, it seems to me, is sort of a superarching structure between Israel and the United States. And Israel and the United States are kind of merged and amalgamated within the structure of this Zionist network, which turns out to be extremely influential. And so anyway, that's how I come to see it, that Israel and the United States, although they have separate structures and entities, but at the upper level, in the way the decisions are actually made, especially when it comes to foreign affairs for the United States and what's going to happen in what they call the Middle East, what people are now calling West Asia, which I think is a nice little revision, that's what I see is going on. And I don't think I'm up to 5 minutes, but I'll stop there. Much more I could say, but we got time. We can go on further. I'd like to see what John has to say, what you have to say.
John?
Well, thank you, Tony. Here's what I would like to say. Let me just preface what I'm going to say with a general observation, which I think is relevant to this discussion. We live in a world in which the very rich, the billionaire plutocracy class, calls the shots. They have the real power. They control the governments, the institutions, the universities. There are lots of people who have lots of different ideas and projects that they try to get going. There are lots of film directors that want to make a film that says such and such. And there are people who write books that say such and such. And there are people who start movements that have ideas. And, you know, Zionism, you just described the long intellectual sort of background briefly, you know, of this Zionist idea. And lots of people were influenced by it. And those ideas did not have anything directly to do with billionaires controlling people. That's true. But here's the fact. The billionaires, with their power, control what ideas get funded, implemented, backed, you know, what ideas become really important in terms of the projects, be it a film, a project, a movement, that get off the ground and become big. And if the billionaires view an idea, a project, an idea, a novel as threatening to them, well, it never reaches very many people. It never has that much of an effect in the real world. And when people come up with ideas for projects or novels or films and so forth, you know, they have their own reasons for liking it, which have nothing to do usually or typically with serving the interests of the billionaire class. Mm-hmm. That's true. But whether their idea or project or film makes it big time or not has everything to do with whether it serves the interests of the billionaire class, whether the person pushing the idea understands that or not. Often they don't. Sometimes they just think, oh my gosh, I'm so lucky. My novel got picked for Oprah's, you know, book
Yeah.
discussion, you know, and they have no idea why.
And I'm chair. I'm made chair of this. I guess I must just be so smart and
yeah, you know, exactly.
Highfalutin that I must be so brilliant that it just happened on my merit.
Yeah.
Not that my ideas happen to conform with what some billionaires want to do.
So there's this idea of the Zionist project to have a state of the Jews. Initially, it was just to have it somewhere. And then it landed on Palestine, you know, for a number of reasons. The British mandate Palestine open to Jewish settlement. That was one. And the other was the Bible, you know, that a lot of Russian Jews thought it made more sense to go to the Holy Land than to go to Nigeria or other places that were in the offing or part of Siberia. I think Stalin was open to that. I think even part of Alaska was in the running for a while. But
they did make a Jewish state in Soviet Union, you know, which rarely gets mentioned. Yeah.
Well, I mean, originally it was the part of Ukraine was where the Jews were settled. The Tsar said that was okay if they settled there as part of the Russian Empire. But anyway, the point I'm making is that yes, there are a lot of ordinary people, not billionaire people, just ordinary people, Jewish people, who were excited about the Zionist project of a Jewish state in Israel. You know, that's why there's so many Jews from Brooklyn, New York, living now as settlers in the West Bank. And, you know, the Russian Jews who immigrated to Israel and so forth. But they're not the people who determined that there really was going to be a Jewish state in Israel. That was the billionaires. It was people like Rothschilds and others. And so what I would like to point out is that among the top is that if we talk about the top leaders of the Zionist movement, the following is true, which is they have a sordid history of attacking and betraying ordinary Jews, starting from the days of the Holocaust and going up to the present day. And their motive, we're talking about David Ben-Gurion and those people, their motive from the days of the Holocaust has been to have a Jewish working class of their own, which they call having a state of their own, implying that it's for the Jews, but it's not. The wealthiest Jews, the billionaires today, have always wanted to have a working class of their own to exploit and get rich off of. And the Zionist project is the way that they get it. And the key to the Zionist project is to make the Palestinians a boogeyman enemy, to scare the living daylights out of ordinary Jews, and for the Israeli billionaire class that controls the government, the same as billionaires control the American government, for the Israeli billionaire class to pretend to be protecting ordinary Israeli Jews from this boogeyman Palestinian enemy, which David Ben-Gurion told them that the Palestinians wanted to drive them into the sea, which was a lie. And let me just now make the final point, and then we can elaborate on all of this. If any billionaire told the sordid truth about how Zionist leaders, how they sabotage rescue efforts during the Holocaust of Jews because it didn't result in sending Jews to Palestine, and things like that. If any billionaire started an independent media company like Oprah Winfrey did and told the public the sordid truth about the Zionist leaders, then the Israel lobby would be dead in the water in a few months, and any politician that was endorsed by the Israel lobby would be worse off than if they were endorsed by Charles Manson or the Church of Satan. And I'll stop there.
Tony, your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, there's so much there. Now, I would say what you're expressing, I've come to see as a kind of communist Jewish view of Zionism. And I'm, looking at what I'm seeing from Tony Greenstein and his book, Zionism During the Holocaust, which came out in 1922. And it got a lot of attention, especially at, Mondoweiss, which is, a Jewish site that is liberal, running on the idea that, we Jews have to kind of be responsible and point to, some of our crimes and such. And electronic intifada, where, people are very frightened of this concept of being accused of being Holocaust deniers. Being accused of being a Holocaust denier is, not a pretty picture. So I see, this, and then I was reminded when I saw Tony Greenstein talking about just what you're explaining, the betrayal of the Zionists of Jews, and sort of saying, well, if they're not going to go to Palestine, they should stay here so they can end up being murdered, and because we need to have some kind of dramatic bang to create the political context to create Israel. So Jews are valuable to us as Israelis, future Israelis, and if they're not going to become future Israelis, they might as well stay in place. And then how the dynamics of this happen. And anyway, then behind that is this Lenny Brenner. And I remember reading about Lenny Brenner, another Jewish communist who looks at things through class relations, and which is a very good way to look at things as far as I can see. The class relations are, so essential to how we structure ourselves socially. And of course, the transfer agreement or the Havara agreement, where the Zionists become very chummy with the Hitler government. And in fact, you have one faction of Zionists creating this boycott movement in the 1930s, when 1933 exactly, when Hitler comes to power, he becomes chancellor, then he gets fully elected as the kind of boss of Germany. Very quickly, Untermeyer, this figure in New York, he creates the boycott movement in 1933, and it becomes serious. Many Jews jump aboard, others jump aboard. He's already complaining about what Hitler, is going to do, but he's just taking power. He hasn't actually done it yet.
Right.
And so anyway, then I start to wonder, was this a move to put the Zionists of Germany in a position where, Hitler would need them and sort of look to them and draw them into the government? And then, of course, you have sort of Adolf Eichmann becoming sort of minister of Zionist affairs within the Hitler government. Anyway, so this idea that somehow Jews were just pulled in to become Zionists. I mean, it wasn't that easy. Jews were fighting often. Many of them were fighting in Spain against fascism. They were, left-wing people. They were socialist people. They were communist people often, who were adamantly against the Zionists, who they recognized were a kind of elite, Jewish would-be ruling class that became a ruling class. Very interesting, like Yad Vashem, the institution of the Holocaust Museum in Israel, is created in 1942. There's that much certainty that what, the Holocaust scenario, which hasn't fully happened yet, it's going to happen. And they have, they're already setting up the narrative vehicle, the Holocaust museums and all of this. Anyway, I think it's a great discussion to think that the elite billionaires, which are largely Zionists, not just Jews but Zionists, that they want to make a Jewish working class and exploit the Jewish working class. Yeah, that seems to be a viable thesis, but it doesn't end there. They have much bigger ideas in mind. And the road to Ben Gvir, and we're going to eliminate the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and we're going to build the third temple, and it's going to become an imperial capital for the world. And we're going to have a repeat of the Sanhedrin, and this is going to be the high court of the world. I mean, the ambitions of the people who founded Israel, especially the Likud branch, the revisionist Zionist branch, the Jabotinsky branch, the Menachem Begin, the Yitzhak Shamir's, Ariel Sharon's, that branch, that Benjamin Netanyahu branch, their ambitions are so enormous and so devastating for the people who aren't part of that agenda. So anyway, is that fair game to bring up those issues?
John?
Well, I'm trying to keep to the, let's engage. Let's go back and forth.
That's good.
Yeah,
John.
Well, relating to the topic of who wags whom, is Israel a tail wagging the American dog or not? Okay, the proof that that Israel is not a tail wagging the American dog, that the American dog wags its own tail, is this.
Right.
Is this.
Who's wagging the tail in the American government?
Well, the billionaire class. They have the power. They wag it.
But
Now,
they're also mostly Zionist Jews around Biden. who
let
have
me,
all the
let me,
topics
let
that
me,
they're
I
posting.
want to address that point
Yeah.
in a second, but let me just make my first point first,
Mhm.
which is that if it were true that the American billionaire class, which is 52, last time I checked, it was 52% non-Jewish,
Mhm.
just for the record.
Okay.
If the American billionaire class was being forced by the Israel lobby to have the United States support Israel, so over the top the way it does, if that were true,
Mhm.
then if they were being forced against their will
Mhm.
to support Israel, then they would be doing things to try to stop being forced against their will. And they could easily, as I pointed out earlier, easily destroy the Israel lobby simply by telling the American public the sordid truth about the anti-ordinary Jewish people behavior and crimes of the Zionist leaders from the days of the Holocaust to the present, which I could talk for an hour about.
Mhm.
I'm assuming, people either know about that or will read the articles that I've posted on the chat that can tell them about it. But if the billionaires simply told the public the truth, the sordid truth about the Zionist leaders, as I said, the Israel lobby would be dead in the water. Why don't the billionaires do that? Not a single one does it. And all it would take is a single one.
A single one of the 52% who are not.
Of any, I don't care. Jewish, non-Jewish, I don't care.
Well, you just made a big issue of 52%, not 51,
I'm
not
not
49,
making a
but
big
52%.
issue of it. I'm just putting it on the table so if people have
Right.
questions, the
Right.
answer will be there. The fact of the matter is that if any billionaire, Jewish or not, I don't care, if any billionaire wanted to destroy the Israel lobby, he or she could do it by simply creating an independent media firm. I say that because some people say, oh, the media is all pro-Zionist. Well, there's a certain truth in that, but so what? To create an independent media firm like Oprah Winfrey did for hers own OWN Media.
And she's not a Zionist? Are you telling me Oprah Winfrey isn't a Zionist?
I'm not saying anything about Oprah Winfrey except that
she could do it. She could make an independent
station. Would you please not interrupt me with silly points?
I think the idea is
what I am
have a
saying,
discussion.
Tony. Tony, the best way to tell what I'm saying is to listen to what I say. I simply said that Oprah Winfrey's independent media firm is an illustration of how a billionaire could create an independent media firm. I said nothing whatsoever about her views on Israel. So why would you accuse me of having said something about that?
Because you're saying it's possible to create a big organized media operation that isn't Zionist, and that Oprah is the example. I don't know about her beliefs, but the power and be Oprah without the Zionists putting her there. And that might sound like a conspiracy theorist, but that's the way the U.S. is organized right now.
A billionaire could do it, and they don't. And the reason they don't do it is because they don't want to do it. And this is why they don't want to do it. But before I give that explanation, let me just address what I think was maybe implicit in what you said, Tony. Some people say, oh, well, a billionaire couldn't do that, couldn't tell the truth because they'd be accused of being an anti-Semite. Let me just point out how absurd that notion is. When I was working as an employee of Harvard University, as a nobody employee of Harvard University, I was outspoken in condemning Zionism and doing it in the way that I've just done it in the last 10 minutes. If I, a nobody with no independent wealth, could do it, then a billionaire, independently wealthy, could do it. And the idea that they can't do it because they would be accused of being anti-Semitic, whereas I did it without that problem, shows that that's absurd to say that the reason they don't do it is because they're afraid of being accused of an anti-Semite, especially if they did it by showing how the Zionist leaders were attacking ordinary Jews.
Right.
Who could accuse a person defending ordinary Jews of being an anti-Semite? When I was at Harvard and I was collecting signatures in support of the right of return of Palestinians, a Jewish colleague was so angry, thinking I was an anti-Semite, stuck his finger a quarter inch from my nose and said, "You're that close to being Hitler." The next day, I had a discussion with him about what I thought about Zionist leaders and how they were oppressing Jews. And he became very friendly and wanted to learn more about it. So do you think that a billionaire couldn't do something like that because someone would accuse him of being an anti-Semite? That's crazy. Now, let me talk about why they really don't want to destroy the power of the Israel lobby. And this is why. First, Israel performs a tremendously valuable role for the billionaire rulers of the world, including of the United States. By their ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, they create the quote Muslim terrorist, freedom-hating Muslim boogeyman enemy, which has to be credible in order for there to be a war on terror, which is one of the main strategies for many years of the American ruling class for controlling the American public and justifying its invasions wherever it felt like invading. Well, they couldn't do that if there wasn't a credible Muslim terrorist, freedom-hating enemy, and Israel creates that enemy by making the Palestinians so angry at Israel and hence easy to be portrayed as this horrible boogeyman enemy. Not to mention, Israel has been funding Hamas for decades and working to keep it in power, still working to keep it in power, by the way, as I've written about at length. And why did the Israeli government do that? Because Hamas is a terrorist organization. It targets non-combatant Israeli civilians for lethal violence, starting with the suicide bombing and the rockets saying,
Hamas is an adjunct of the Likud party.
Would you stop interrupting?
For a long time. No, we're told that we should try to speak within 5 minutes.
It's true. We should try and alternate around.
Okay, but the reason,
and you lay in layer upon layer upon layer of narrative, and then the Israel performs this service of making the Palestinians the boogeyman enemy, the very frightening boogeyman enemy that the war on terror required. And so billionaires need to have the Americans controlled by fear of a boogeyman enemy. It was the communists in Soviet Union, and then it was the war on terror. And so they don't want to upset that apple cart. They want to keep it going. That's why they fund Israel. And the entire thing that Israel does is it makes the conflict in the world non-class, ethnic, national, and that's very valuable. And so there's absolutely no reason why billionaires in the United States want to stop supporting Israel. In fact, the power of the Israel lobby comes from the American billionaire ruling class. And the reason there are so many Jews in the United States government, I will talk next when it's my turn. Yeah, thanks. And that's very illuminating. And there's a lot of truth in what you're conveying there. I don't want to dismiss it, but I do want to offer another lens of interpretation, which I think has also, and I think a stronger resonance about it. I hope I can develop that now. Now,
Mhm.
there's no doubt that the United States, developed with a sort of white Anglo-Saxon ruling class that had, huge amount of influence, uh, and uh, uh, the Jews were very important in the development of the United States, the development of the United States economy, and had important roles like the Rothschilds. They have to get a front man, J.P. Morgan. And J.P. Morgan, the name, and looking at him, you wouldn't think he was the agent of Rothschilds, but he was. Rothschilds has a name that sort of sticks out. Rockefeller isn't a Jewish name, and they're not Jewish. Rockefeller have had that role in the United States without collaborating with the same people that J.P. Morgan was collaborating with? So, there is this idea, this picture of the United States, which, definitely there is a ruling class of the United States, which is not Jewish, which is not Zionist, which has played a big role, and it's still around. When I see Colonel McGregor or something, I kind of see, well, he's kind of speaking for that class.
Right.
But there is a, the social media, the movie about Zuckerberg, and they rank the girls at Harvard, and then there's this WASP group, and they're going to use this bright Jewish kid, for their purposes, and because they can see the internet's on the horizon, and they're going to make a fortune, and Zuckerberg is going to be their cash cow kind of. But then Zuckerberg is very brilliant and cunning, and he sort of turns the tables, and that's the plot of the movie. Now, actually, Facebook was being created by the CIA, and it wasn't a bunch of guys at Harvard, ranking girls. That may have been a part of it. That's the front story. But the deeper story is there is this Jewish takeover of the ruling class, who just can't cope with the brilliance and the strategic nature of Jewish bright people, and increasingly to be a Jewish entrepreneur, you have to play along with this Zionist thing, and everybody has to play along with the Zionist thing, including Oprah or whatever. You've heard the term Shabbos goy, which I think is a very useful term. Like, it doesn't mean that Zionism is limited to Jewish people. There's a big religion called Christian Zionism. And then there is this concept. The word is very significant. You've heard the word, John. I'm sure you know what it means. That well, the Jews have their Sabbath on Saturday, but they have businesses, so they have to run the business on Saturday. So they get somebody to do it for them, a non-Jew, usually a Christian Jew, and on the Sabbath, and then they're goy. So this term Shabbos goy is very important. Like, the Zionist rich billionaire movement isn't exclusively the purview and the domain of Jewish Zionists. There's it just becomes such a powerful trajectory. Now let's get down to brass tacks here. Have you read Laurent Guillenot's books looking at JFK and 9/11 as essentially Israel First jobs, Zionist jobs? So there, the book describes, the Kennedy family, especially John and Robert, who were both assassinated. And especially in the case of John, he wants to stop Dimona. He wants to stop Israel and Ben-Gurion from getting, nuclear weapons. And so he attributes the assassination of Kennedy to that. I've looked at the case of Forrestal, and Forrestal jumped out of a hospital window or something, but he was a very adamant, he didn't like this. Many in the State Department were not happy with this throwing the weight in with this new entity called Israel. And, and even Truman was not really going along with it. And they had to give him $5 million in a suitcase and, change the people around him. So to oppose the rise of Zionism in the United States was a lethal proposition. So the takeover wasn't just because, you know, they were so rich and successful. I mean, there was a very ruthless, and still is a ruthless aspect of it. I don't know what your experience at the university is, but my own experience is I've seen, you know, and I think Emanuel has too, is, you know, we've experienced the ruthlessness of,
Right.
you know, there's going to be a narrative. And so the idea that, you know, somehow the non-Jews are going to expose the Zionists. No, the non-Jews who are billionaires know what's, you know, they've got to, you've got to conform to things. And then we can talk about, you know, the Federal Reserve System and the, you know, Paul Warburg and the role of skewing the development of the American economy, that it creates so much money that goes in, you know, to a certain portion of the society, which is largely Jewish and which is, you know, and increasingly Zionist, because somehow this Zionist movement starts to get into the domestic politics.
So I wanted to make a comment about Israel's state in the world and the United States from a slightly different angle, which is technology. In Washington, D.C., there really are two big powers these days. There's the Israel lobby, and then there's the Taiwan lobby. And they, in some ways, they collaborate. Sometimes they fight with each other, but they really, their power comes in part from an enormous amount of money, but specifically from monopolies on specific technologies that Israel and Taiwan have systematically acquired very smartly or ruthlessly over the last 30 years, and in different fields, of course. Taiwan more on semiconductors specifically, and the production of chips for smartphones, but also in other computers. In Israel, in biotechnology, nanotechnology, surveillance systems, satellite technology, and other fields, including IT, and that command of technology fields, especially as the United States is hollowing out at a very rapid rate, is also one of the things behind Israel, why it's such a, you know, it is wagging the dog to some degree, or a half-dead dog. Maybe you could say it's wagging the dog because the dog is weakened, and Israel is also weakened in some respects and is in a very precarious position. But it's, in a strange way, it's invigorated, right? I mean, now there are all these international what do you call it, expositions for both weapon systems, security systems, police, you know, outfits, surveillance, in which Jewish startup companies go there and very proudly say, well, you know, since Gaza tested, you know, this is the best you can get, and they've made tremendous inroads in terms of security, you know, in Shanghai, in New Orleans, you know, in South Dakota, all over the place, and this emerging new approach to security and technology is also a large part of why Israel has this disproportionate sort of place at the table. But anyway.
So you're the host. Let us know what we should do.
Well, I'll let John say a few things. I know he didn't have a chance to talk for a moment, and then we'll come back to Tony.
He had plenty of chance to talk. Yeah.
Say that.
So who's on?
Oh,
you, John.
Go ahead briefly, John, and then we'll go to Tony.
Okay. The fact is, as is well known, that there are a lot of Jews in the American foreign policy establishment. Elliott
Right.
Abram comes to mind, and our Secretary of State Blinken, so on.
Right.
And so I want to point out that the reason that's true is because supporting Israel is a key strategic policy of the American ruling class, for reasons that I pointed out.
Right.
And obviously Jewish individuals have not only a ruling class strategy motive for supporting Israel, but an emotional, sentimental one, because they're Jews, and they have a connection to it for all those emotional, sentimental reasons. Right. So it's fairly obvious that you're going to have a lot of especially enthusiastic Jews wanting to enforce this pro-Israel policy, and that's why there's so many of them, right, visible in the foreign policy establishment. They are the effect of pro-Israel being a strategy of the American ruling class. They are not the cause of the pro-Israel foreign policy. They are an effect of the fact that the American ruling class has a strategic interest in supporting Israel. So I just wanted to make that. The second point, if I could, is that the idea that Israel tail wags the American dog, let's face it, that gets its credibility. First of all, it's not credible on the surface because tails don't wag dogs. Little countries with 6 million or whatever it is Jews don't wag a 330 million United States population country. I mean, it's just on the surface, it seems absurd. So why does it gain any traction at all? Well, the traction it gets comes from the anti-Semitic trope, the canard that Jews have some kind of mysterious power to control non-Jews throughout history, the secret protocols of Zion or whatever it's called. That it's a trope, and it gets a certain resonance from that anti-Semitic trope, because on the surface it's an absurd theory. So the other thing is that if we mistakenly think that the pro-Israel foreign U.S. policy comes from the fact that the Jews and Israel control it, then that leads to a very mistaken plan for how to deal with that problem. Based on that wrong notion, you would say, well, we have to, get the non-Jews, the non-Zionist billionaires in power and help them get power. And there are people who say that. There are people who say stupidly that, well, big oil is really the force in the U.S. ruling class that we should help to regain power, because big oil is harmed by the U.S. pro-Israel foreign policy, because it makes it difficult for big oil to make deals with the Saudis and so forth, with the U.S. being so pro-Israel and so on. And it's stupid, because actually big oil is just as much in support of the pro-Israel foreign policy as any other part of the American billionaire class. So, and the other thing is that the Saudis like that the U.S. arms Israel. The Middle Eastern dictatorships like that the U.S. arms Israel. Why? Because these dictatorships, on the one hand, use their pretend opposition to Zionism to make themselves look good in the eyes of the have-nots that they oppress.
Understood.
Who would ordinarily be trying to overthrow them, but they try to use their opposition to Israel to make it, to deflect anger at them from their own have-nots. But they don't want to really overthrow Israel, because Israel is a great boogeyman enemy. So what is their excuse for not really overthrowing Israel. Well, their excuse is Israel's too strong militarily. So they actually need Israel to be strong militarily, and they thank the United States for making it so. I'll stop there.
All right, Tony, your perspective.
Okay, well, that was very interesting. It didn't address the paradigm that Emanuel introduced, which is, let's look at this through a technological lens. So, I'd like to have a crack at that.
Please.
But just on a general level, in responding to John, you refer to something called non-Zionist billionaires. Well, you're actually talking about billionaires who are not Jewish. Those are not interchangeable. Like, can you be a billionaire and be, hanging out and conducting business with the Zionist elite, and say, but you'll respect me. I'm not a Zionist, and I don't agree with you on these things, and we'll just continue to do business. Or it doesn't work that way. You've got to make a commitment. If you're going to be a billionaire, you've got to go with the flow, and the flow is definitely a Zionist flow, and you've got to accept a kind of Israel first view of the world, or you're not going to be a billionaire, and you're not going to. And Oprah obviously had to do that. Everybody who gets there, that's one of the things that we have to live with, that every elite that we see on the television, they're all Zionists, and they only talk about it. Like we hear, we remember this Bannon fellow came along, and he's talking for Donald Trump, and he's disagreeing with the Biden group so heavily, and we think, oh, look, democracy is really doing well. Look at all the things they disagree with. But then you find out, Bannon is a total Zionist. And, the people he's arguing with are total. Well, I'm just getting started. I'm like you. I have a thesis. I'm a university professor. I get to talk like you do. We talk for 2 hours, and people are, they have to listen to us because, we're giving out the grades. So excuse me, but I'll try to. But I think, I'm delighted to have an opportunity to say these things, because it's hard to say these things. It's hard to find anybody who will entertain, this discussion, because it's a poisonous discussion. Right. People go to jail,
if they're lucky.
For talking about the Holocaust in the wrong way. Like, it's so, you're dealing with such a powerful thuggish group here that, really need some comeuppance. And, I'm just a little old goy, and I'm in a little old town, and I'm nowhere near in New York or Boston or Harvard or, and I've got no voice. It doesn't matter what I say, like you say. It doesn't matter what I say, because I'm not in tune with the people who decide things. But still, so I would just point out that there are people like Philip Giraldi, who I've got to know fairly well. He hangs out with a group in Iran, as I do. We go to conferences and such in Iran, or he's banned from going to conference. And he's a CIA chap who I'm
listening.
Has a job in a NGO, to say that it's not in the national interest of the United States to have such a close relationship with Israel. And he's very outspoken, saying, there could be a day like after, in the era of after 1945, like there's let's even go back to the time of the Balfour Declaration. There's the Suez Canal, and it's surrounded by hostile Arab Muslim people. And so let's, create this little outpost of we, the Western, white people, civilized people. And so let's create Israel by the Suez Canal. And then the U.S. takes up this challenge and says, well, we need our own base, our own aircraft carrier that's stationary in that region. And that, there was a time when Israel may have served U.S. foreign policy. And there's definitely U.S. people deep in the system who want greater Israel. They want to see a bigger, more powerful, more effective Israel. And Likud people, fit that bill. But So there's Mearsheimer as well, Geraldi and Mearsheimer, both. I think Mearsheimer, I think he is Jewish, but I'm not sure of that. But anyway, there are influential academic voices who say, no, it's not in Israel's interest anymore. It's a liability for us, for the United States.
Mearsheimer is pretty easy on Israel from my perspective. I mean, he doesn't really take them to task.
Oh, well, anyway, he does repeatedly say, it's not in the interests of, and all these people on Judge Napolitano, say that.
Right. Right.
So now let's get to this issue of the technology. Like
Mhm.
Israel, of course, one of the things that they have going in their technology is they are great spies. They spy on all the high-tech things going on in the United States, and they have lots of people who cooperate with them.
Mhm.
Pollard, the famous spy,
Mhm.
so a lot of this genius of these Israel-based companies are, they're great spies. They have back doors on everything. I liked it when you said Gaza tested, but
Right.
this Promise software, which had a big part of its history in Canada, like basically the history of back doors, where you sell a computer program to the RCMP, the Canadian police force, for instance, but you don't tell them that you can spy yourself. You can use this software to spy on other people, but we're going to be spying on you while Maxwell, like Ghislaine's father, who was a
Right.
big famous Mossad agent, given
Right.
some kind of famous funeral when he died.
Right.
He was into selling this Promise software. So Israel, became a kind of leader in spying also on the internet. And then if you can do that, you can also, build the security blocks,
Mhm.
to do this. So Israel has that reputation. But one thing now is, in order to do all this software work, and you have to have a secure place. You have to be able to come in to work every morning and know
Right.
that your laboratory and your software it's not all going to be bombed and exploded.
Right.
And so now Israel is, suffering from the fact it can't guarantee that
Right.
these, very delicate Gaza tested, there's so much behind that Gaza tested. Like, you should probably explain that, Emmanuel, because
Got to test it.
there's
Well, I
so
mean,
much behind
right.
that concept, yeah, that beating up and punishing and pacifying and torturing, the Palestinians, then you become expert on how you do these things, and then you sell that expertise,
Well, I mean,
and you have conventions and everything, and then people go back and do that to dissidents,
right.
like they apply it to, the Occupy people or the people who are the descendants of, the
Right.
dissidents, end up
If I could just
being
say a word,
treated as Palestinians.
I'll
Yeah.
just say one word on that particular point. It's not just technology in the sense of like a sensor or a chip, right? It's lawfare. It's how you gum up the legal system. It's ways of avoiding responsibility. It's systems of creating checkpoints to break down people's ability to move. It's the strategy developed in the occupied territories of slow transformation, where you like build a small little barrier, then it becomes a bigger barrier like in 6 months, and then a higher barrier in a year, and then it has a machine gun on top of it in 2 years. And it's sort of this certain psychological understanding of how, in fact, it's doing it slowly rather than quickly is a very effective way. And those very same technologies are being used in the United States and around the world now to try and separate us from each other and divide us up. And it's being sold. I mean, a lot of the United States police forces are buying technology and know-how and even consulting from Israeli firms.
Yeah,
Go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Jack.
Okay, I would like to clarify what I believe makes American billionaires tick. First of all, virtually all the American billionaires are pro-Israel.
Right.
There are no anti-Zionist American billionaires.
Right.
When I referred to non-Zionist billionaires, I was referring to what does not exist, but what James, I forget his name, the guy who advocates supporting big oil as the way to, stop U.S. support for Israel. He wrongly says that there are anti-Zionist billionaires who keep their views secret, but they really are. He wrongly says it. I do not say it. So let me just also clarify. The reason that there are no anti-Zionist American billionaires is because the billionaires advocate what is useful for keeping the have-nots divided against each other, because that's the way billionaires remain billionaires. And as I explained earlier, Israel divides the have-nots by creating a massive conflict that's not have-nots versus haves, but Jews versus Palestinians, or Jews versus Muslims, and however you want to generalize it. And that's why the billionaires,
gays versus straights, or white versus blacks, or
well, I mean, Israel doesn't do that mainly, but other people do. But
who are Zionists who want to protect their positions. They do divide and conquer prolifically.
But
ADL or whatever.
Let me point out a parallelism that I think clarifies it. Has nothing to do with Israel directly. The fact of the matter is that the ruling class of the United States, since before the United States was the United States, since the initiation of chattel slavery based on race, has divided the have-nots along race lines, and has aggressively pushed the idea that whites benefit from the oppression, the special oppression of blacks, and it's now called white privilege, but didn't used to be that phrase. But whites were told that they benefited from the enslavement of blacks, and that they benefited from Jim Crow and so forth. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but Frederick Douglass explicitly said that was not true, that ordinary white people were also harmed by the enslavement, chattel slavery of blacks. And Martin Luther King famously explained in his 1965 speech in Selma, Alabama, that the purpose of the racist Jim Crow laws was not just to keep and oppress the blacks, which was obvious, but to keep the poor whites poor and to oppress the poor whites. And that's also what its function was. And he explained it. But not a single book or publication that gets any, serious audience, or institution, or American politician, never mind American billionaires, ever explain that the racial discrimination against non-whites harms, not benefits, ordinary whites. Not a single one. And the reason is because they understand that the lie that racial discrimination against blacks benefits whites is a crucial part of how the upper class stays in power. They all understand that. And it's the same thing with support for Israel, whether they're Jewish or not. They have advisors like Condoleezza Rice and the late Henry Kissinger and others whose names I don't know, but they have smart advisors. And if they can't figure it out themselves, their advisors explain it to them that you've got to be pro-Israel. It's against your class interests.
Right.
Otherwise, has
Right.
nothing to do with whether you're Jewish or not.
Right. Listen, I wanted to ask Tony a question. It's related, but not exactly the same topic. But I wanted to, on the recent Netanyahu visit to Washington, D.C., in which he was president for a day or 2 days, in which essentially there was no president, and he got whatever 60 standing ovations from the entire Congress, something he couldn't possibly have gotten in Israel. So what was going on? How do you explain this? And what is the structure? What underlies this bizarre course of events?
Netanyahu grew up in the United States. Netanyahu has, talent scouted. He was almost too good to be true when you see him in, some of the early, when he's just coming on board, and he's handsome. You see him as a young man. He's very handsome. He's very articulate, and he can make the concept like, no, the Palestinians shouldn't have their own state. And the Palestinians really, don't have any specific prior rights in that region. And, he's able to make these arguments in a kind of a persuasive way, as long as you don't know any history. And people didn't, as this, issue of Israel coming into the picture as a big time player. So he got, he's had a tremendous career. And he's, played the Muslim terrorist card perfectly. He kind of created that card in 1979 when he had this conference on, international terrorism, all about Muslims and such. So that's a good topic, but I want to, there's limited time, and I think I have a perspective that goes into history that is a unique interpretation that I can offer. And so yes, slavery. Well, if you're a working class white person, having people, who are slaves, who work for free, work for nothing, that isn't too good for, your position in trying to have decent wages and be paid well.
Right.
And, we could go into that. But, there is another group in the United States called the Native Americans. There's the slaves, and, and then oftentimes, it's sort of said in a very quick way, well, yeah, and then there was the genocide of the Native Americans, and that was racist. So the U.S. has a very, dubious foundation of slavery and the treatment of Native Americans. But usually then you go on to analyze the slavery issue, which you can do, and then you get to, oh, it has a happy ending. Slavery ended, it took a civil war, but it has a happy ending. But the Native American story has no happy ending.
Right.
The story continues. So as I see it, and so I, my professional area was Native American studies, and so I taught this and developed this, and I was very interested by, well, what about the land? The United States is the 13 colonies. And they have a revolution. They reject Great Britain. Why? Well, because taxation, we're told. Well, wait a minute. To the west of the 13 colonies is all this land. And somebody is going to get rich developing this land. And is it going to be, elites in Great Britain that do that? Or, so Britain was starting to take over this Western expansion and actually have friendly relations with the Indians and take over from the French and say, we're going to regulate this Western expansion, and we're going to get our piece of the action, and we're going to keep control of this process. And that, to me, is the central dynamic of the American Revolution, because it's the class interests of those who said no, and Benjamin Franklin was a land speculator. He was working with all these land speculators in France. George Washington was a land speculator, and to be in the British Army, you would get paid some land rights, and he put together various deals. this land speculation issue is enormous. And who's going to benefit from these lands? So let me put out the interpretation that the United States is the most successful land speculation in history. Like the simple process of lands going up from, 5 cents an acre to $10 an acre to $200 an acre to, if it's in Manhattan, what's it use? What's an acre worth in Manhattan? Like,
Right.
And the whole Western Hemisphere going through this process of land, earth into property is my book, like
Right.
privatizing the resources. So who's going to privatize, between the 13 colonies in California? That was a lucrative thing. And the Rothschilds were getting in the action. And basically, who were the land speculators? They were the powerful European, money movers who were, the Rothschilds disguised themselves in various ways. But when I saw the deal to create the Federal Reserve in the United States, the 1913 deal, and it's funny, I can find this document. I used to be able to find it on the internet, but you can't find it anymore.
Never
But when
happened.
I looked at all of these banks that were listed, that had, standing, that were essentially going to be the owners of the Federal Reserve, I could see they were all extensions of these land speculation companies from
Right.
prior the American Revolution, after the American Revolution. So the Federal Reserve was sort of the land speculators cashing in their earnings and sort of saying, well, we basically own, the land, or we, sold it off and benefited enormously, and we've got power. Now we're going to use that power to take over the banking system. And so it had this, not to, I don't know, I can't prove every name on that list was somehow connected to the Rothschild empire.
Right.
But it was a very cunningly, depicted, and Paul Warburg was with them, and who created the Federal Reserve System. So I just, add to that idea of, slavery and interpretations of slavery, that this is a unique, I've never got an inch of of mileage on this, although I've written about it. Like, as you say, John, those in charge, they can just put an idea off on the side, and this idea wouldn't be too popular with the people
I can't imagine.
who are running the United States. And how did they get that power? And what about this little thing called history? And it turns out that you can find a lot looking at the native people, because
Right.
really that is a big part of the history of capitalism. The increase of expanding the money supply and inflating and the money supply. As long as you have something behind it, like a whole frontier zone, like the United States had for a long period of time, or then
Right.
when they got to that frontier, then there was all the rest of, Western Hemisphere, and they kind of took over from Great Britain in Latin America, and they took over from Great Britain here, there, and everywhere, and they've been able to expand.
And Spain.
And Spain, and a lot of United States was Spain, was
Right.
New Spain, and a lot of New United States was New France, was Canada, and so this whole history of sort of appropriating empires. And with it, what about, the Philippines and all of that? That was Spain.
Well, listen, Tony, I'm sorry. I don't mean to
Yeah.
cut you off. We just ran out of time. But
But
I want to,
it's a very compelling interpretation.
Well,
It's
I hope we can
I'm
meet
among
again.
colleagues here. Yeah.
I hope we can meet again. And I'll just say in closing that we will meet again. We'll give a chance for John to continue the
Yeah.
conversation. I just wanted to say I appreciate Tony's comments, because they show the parallels between Israel and the United States in terms of how they came into being and what their motivations are, and how you create value out of nothing at an ideological and even philosophical level. And I thank you both for joining me, and we'll talk again.